Hi everyone, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 13 in your textbook. Please read Chapter 13 very carefully. There's a lot of information in it that I don't have time to address in this lecture. Okay, let's talk about how to write an argumentative essay. The main goal of an argument paper should be to defend a position on a topic with clear and logical reasoning so that the unbiased reader will, if not be convinced, at least be aware that the position is a reasonable one. If someone already agrees with you, not much argument is needed. You do, however, need to avoid bad arguments as they may actually push people away from your viewpoint and provide some new examples and information that they might not already have. If someone is pig-headed and biased, no matter how good your argument is, they may not accept your conclusion, but you can certainly try. Look for common ground, things that you both can agree with. Persuasion is not generally instantaneous. It's the culmination of many persuasive messages over days, weeks, months, or even years. Your persuasive message, along with others, will be used by your audience to come to a conclusion on your topic. Is yours the tipping point? Maybe, maybe not. It is important to think before you write. The more you do, the less frustrating writing is going to be. Follow these steps. Know yourself. Know your audience. Choose and narrow your topic. Write a sentence that expresses your main claim. That's your thesis statement. Gather ideas by brainstorming and researching, and organize those ideas. We're going to look at each of these. You need to look at yourself before anything else. Are you prepared to be precise and accurate, offer only premises you believe, to be fair to the other side, and credit your sources? This paper isn't about winning. It's about taking a stand on a topic that you feel strongly about and presenting your arguments well. You've been working up to this all semester, but you're now ready to clearly state your thesis and defend it well. Remember, this isn't an argument in the common sense of the word. You will defend your beliefs by making claims that you can defend, while also bringing up and refuting the other side fairly. You might need to do some preliminary research before you proceed, but you should also keep in mind that you're going to have to look at the arguments of the opposition. Are you afraid to do that? Have you always thought that people who think differently are stupid idiots who just can't see the truth? Some research into those arguments will hopefully convince you that that's not the case. What if you find out that their arguments are actually better than yours? How scary is that? I'm only asking these questions because I want you to consider them. People generally believe they have good reasons for holding an opinion. They don't generally say, well, I'm wrong, but I don't care. Their reasons may be fallacious in nature, but they probably don't think they are. It's up to you to point those things out with fairness and accuracy. Quite simply, your intended audience should greatly affect your writing style and what evidence you include. This is true of all writing. Your text to your grandma are quite different than your text to your significant other. But always be sure to know who your audience is and use appropriate language and evidence. In the case of this paper, I'm the main person who's going to be reading this, but consider your audience to be an academically oriented person. You are writing for an educated audience. Now, the next part is very important. You should never change your position on a topic simply because your audience will be more receptive as a result. The audience should affect your choice of language, not your conclusion. Just because I'm the one reading your paper, don't think that because I might tend to have more liberal viewpoints that you need to pretend that you think differently than you do about your topic. That's simply dishonest and unethical. That having been said, anticipating your readers' reactions, like the kind of objections that they might raise, will help you to write a more persuasive argument because you can bring up those objections and show that they're not justified. Try to appeal to common values instead of just telling them that they're wrong. Look for commonalities. We all have things we can agree with. It's a good idea to assume that your audience is skeptical, but open-minded and willing to listen to your side. Don't overstep your bounds. Not even the smartest of us tries to tackle wide topics all at once, even in a book. Make sure to be specific. Instead of writing about a topic as broad as modern work relations in America, write about something more specific. whether employers have the right to read their employees' emails. You may want to limit your topic even more. Maybe only talk about the rights of larger corporations to read their employees' emails. Now, rephrase this as a question. You're doing this so you can phrase your thesis statement as a claim that answers that question. So you would be asking, do large corporations have the right to read an employee's emails? Now you need to write that sentence that expresses your claim. This is so simple, but it is essential. Yet so many students have a problem with it or simply neglect to do it. An argument paper defends a conclusion, a thesis. A thesis must be a statement that can be either true or false. So write down the statement that you plan to defend. Make sure it's something that could be either true or false. Could someone disagree with it? Your thesis can't be, I will address whether large corporations have a right to monitor employee email. That may be what you're going to do, but that's not your conclusion. Remember, a statement is something that you can add, it is true that, or it is false that, too. And you can't do that with this. It would be, it is true that large corporations may or may not have the right to monitor employee email, and it simply doesn't make sense to do that. You need to take a stand. Your thesis should be something like, I will argue that large corporations do have the right to monitor employee emails, because you can say, it is true that large corporations have the right to monitor employee emails. This is obviously a better thesis sentence. Remember, you're not arguing whether or not something is true. You're taking a side and saying that that side is true. You need to take a stand and defend it. Gathering ideas and coming up with arguments is not a straightforward process. Some people do lots of research before they come up with their ideas. Others might write their basic ideas down first and then do some research. There isn't one right way to do it, but it needs to be done before you can start organizing your paper. One effective way to come up with ideas is by brainstorming. This is a process in which you don't try to be too coherent. You're coming up with ideas without regard as to whether they sound intelligent in the moment. It's just that they are somehow connected to the topic. Some writers like to free write, where they just spend several minutes writing whatever comes to mind when they think about the topic. Others do what's called mind mapping, where they write the topic in the middle of a page and then connect words and phrases to it with lines. You can look mind mapping up on Google Images if you're unsure about it. So for our examples about employee emails, you might come up with some arguments on either side of the debate, like the ones listed here. Then once you're done, look over what you've written. Is any of it obviously false, based on fallacies? Is there some middle ground you might have overlooked? Now you're going to start to think on paper. Ideas can be fleshed out by thinking about stories and descriptions that fit, deciding if something in particular causes something else to happen, classifying things by putting them into categories, comparing and contrasting them to other things, illustrating your ideas with good examples, and defining exactly what you're talking about. Then look over what you've written to decide some things. Should you refine your thesis? Does it need to be modified, narrowed down even further, qualified in some way? Do you need additional premises? In other words, did you come up with other reasons to support your thesis? Are there things that you're not sure about, so you need to find out about them? And finally, you may need to exclude some things that you simply don't have time to address. So you may need to pick the best premises or reasons to support your thesis and leave some other ones out. Remember everything you learned in Chapter 12 and in our library research workshop. You can always go back and review if you need to. You may have needed to do some preliminary research before, but now is the time to buckle down and really do some serious research. It's your job to gather facts, to be able to distinguish those facts from non-facts, which are opinions and unsupported assertions. Research reports, statistics, reports of actual events, those are good pieces of evidence. Even if you think you know something for sure, you might want to check it out just in case, because you might be wrong. Make sure your sources pass the CRAP test. And just in case you think you can't use opinions, yes, you can. You just need to make sure that they are informed opinions by informed people or experts that can be backed up by corroborating evidence. And of course, let your audience know that the testimony of these people is opinion. But if they are sources with high credibility, your audience should be able to trust them. Now you can start to organize your ideas. Organization can seem difficult. What you need to do is put your ideas together in a way that makes it easier for your audience to understand them. There are a couple of organizational patterns you can use depending on what your thesis is. If your thesis is that something is the cause of something else happening, like Donald Trump's election happened largely due to white middle-class anger, that's a cause-effect organizational pattern. You might want to try problem solution. If your thesis is that something is a serious problem that can only be solved or is most likely to be solved in a certain way, such as the best way to prevent terrorism in the United States is to take extreme caution when vetting immigrants. You can also organize your arguments by definition. If your thesis hangs on the precise definition of a term, such as buying a term paper off the internet is plagiarism, and you need to define exactly what plagiarism is and how buying a term paper meets those requirements or meets that definition. I really like the organizational pattern shown in this illustration on the right. In it, you set up your thesis and give us any necessary background information in the introduction, and that's the part shown in green. Then you lay out your specific claims and evidence for those claims in support of your thesis. That's the purple part. Then you bring up and refute a few opposing views. That's the red part. Then you summarize and conclude, and that's the yellow part. It's fairly straightforward and makes for a very clear argument that's easy for the reader to follow. Now you're going to write a first draft. This phase is very important. Don't think you can just write one draft and be done with it. You're going to revise your paper several times before you turn it in. If you've done the necessary prep work beforehand, it shouldn't be too difficult to write. We're going to look at the 4 steps to writing a first draft. It's usually a good idea to have an opening statement that's unique and interesting and leads well into a discussion of your thesis. I wouldn't start by just telling us your thesis. Rather, you want to start with some facts, statistics, maybe an example that leads to the revelation of your topic. If you've taken public speaking and written speeches before, you know how to do this. You may have run across some information in your research and thought it would make a good way to start your paper. Well, you're probably right. Then once you've done that, you may need to discuss the topic's importance. Give some context to show why it is important. If you're arguing for something that's generally accepted to be the case, you might need to show why you're bothering to defend it. Just because lots of people already agree with it, there may be a certain number of people who don't. Or the opposite may be true. You might be arguing for the unpopular side of a topic. So talk about why you're doing that. Make sure within the first few introductory paragraphs that you're clearly stating your thesis, the main claim you want the reader to accept. Don't forget to do this, and don't assume the reader is just going to figure it out. This isn't a mystery novel. You don't want the reader to have to work harder than they are willing to. If you need to define some terms, this is a good place to do it. Also, before you get into the body of the paper, you should give a brief preview of how you're going to defend your thesis. So you might want to include some detail on what your premises are, what objections you will look at, and in what order. The book refers to this as a roadmap to help the reader see where you're going. Now you're ready to get into your arguments. These are your claims supported with reasons and evidence. A good rule is to start each body paragraph with a topic sentence and develop each paragraph with details that support the topic sentence. What you're doing here is what we've looked at all along. The structure of arguments, where the conclusion is the first sentence in the paragraph, and the premises, which are the reasons and evidence that show why the conclusion is true, follow after that. Try to make sure your arguments flow as well as possible from one to the next. If you're following the argument essay structure that I showed you earlier, your first several body paragraphs are going to be the arguments that show why your thesis is correct, followed by a few paragraphs where you bring up and refute the opposing viewpoints. And finally, the conclusion. You don't want to just end without wrapping things up. It's always a good idea to summarize, meaning to restate your thesis and your main claims, then conclude with a satisfying ending. Here are a couple of ideas for concluding statements. You can always return to an example that you started with in the introduction. You can make a prediction about what's going to happen involving your topic. You can ask a related yet answered question, call for some kind of action, end with a different story, But by all means, emphasize the importance of your claim. And of course, you need a bibliography with all your sources on it. Once you've written the first draft, put it aside for a day or two, and then go back and look at it again. It's good to take a break. If you stare too long at something, you start to not be able to really see it, and you may not see some obvious mistakes. There are 5 steps to the revision process. Read what you've written and revise it. Consider what you have not written and revise if necessary. Show your work, edit your work, and hand it in. Let's look at them. Read it and revise as necessary. Obviously, this means grammar, spelling, and language, but it may mean to revise the way you approach things. Try to read it from the vantage point of someone who disagrees with you, and try to identify if you're making a good case or if you're ignoring some major objections, assuming what you've always thought is true, or maybe committing other critical thinking mistakes. Ask yourself if you're making a good case. Ask yourself if you've left out serious objections, like opposing viewpoints. You obviously don't have to address every objection, but if something is really obvious, you might need to revise your work to address it. Then show your work to someone else. This is where the Writing Center tutors can really help you. They look at papers all the time and can likely give you some good feedback. They can also help you edit your work in terms of grammar and spelling, and can show you how to check your bibliography for correct formatting. And finally, submit it to the Dropbox for grading by the due date. You could revise forever, but you don't want to do that. Do your best, and then hand it in. If you follow these tips, the chances of turning in a good or even a great paper are very high. This is the end of the lecture on Chapter 13.